Today we are going to analyze the introduction to an article by the American Civil Liberties Union having to do with civil rights and how the government should deal with pandemics in the community. Before looking at the article, I want to call your attention to a recent example of civil disobedience. Last Monday, a large number of citizens gathered to protest the shelter-in-place edict by Governor Gavin Newsom. The event was organized by a group called the Freedom Angels, who have in the past protested the use of mandatory vaccines in the California public school system. A number of protesters Monday were concerned that the shutdown would harm the economy and their job status, as they were being forced to stay at home from work. Because there were hundreds of people gathered together Wednesday, some who did not have masks and some who were not following the governor's temporary rule to remain 6 feet apart, the California Highway Patrol, upholding Governor Newsom's edict, temporarily banned any further gatherings at the state capitol. So let's look to the American Civil Liberties interpretation of community rights and government responsibilities in a pandemic situation. Let's look at the background at the time that this document was written in 2008 by 4 experts in health, bioethics, medicine, and law from the universities of Boston and Northwestern. A deadly strain of avian influenza had killed hundreds of millions of birds throughout the world, and hundreds of millions more had been destroyed by farmers who were scared that this pandemic among their domesticated birds, such as chickens and ducks, could spread into the human population. To health officials of governments throughout the world, this brought back memories of the 1918-1919 outbreak of influenza that killed more people than any other pandemic since the Black Death in the Middle Ages. The 1918-1919 pandemic outbreak killed 50 to 100 million people, many of whom were young and healthy. Let's look at the second chunk, not law enforcement. Do you remember David Henry Thoreau's point that government is an expedient, a tool to help a community to exist in freedom but with wisdom? He writes in Civil Disobedience that the standing army, which in our present situation is the California Highway Patrol, is only an arm of the standing government. The government itself, which is the only mode which people have chosen to execute their will, is equally liable to be abused and perverted before the people can act through it. Thoreau is constantly reminding us that we are the government, but once in a while, the tools of government, like governors whom we have elected, use law enforcement as a means to enforce laws that we would hope preserve our community with wisdom and in the name of freedom. In their article on pandemic preparedness, the need for a public, not a law enforcement national security approach, the authors point out that when confronted with communicable disease, publicly harmful diseases, individuals can take measures to reduce their risk of infection. Their effort cannot fully succeed, nor can a community's risk be significantly reduced without concerted actions that have to be coordinated by the entire community. However, the American Civil Liberty article goes on to say the notion that we must trade liberty for security is both false and dangerous. They go on to say that it is false because they believe being coercive, forcing somebody to do something, will not lead to public health. And the American Civil Liberties believes it is dangerous because it could prove to be a good excuse to suppress public civil liberties. They end this part by saying public health is not a law enforcement or national security problem. Finally, we will examine the last part of this presentation of the American Civil Liberties article on pandemic preparedness. This part is called Chunk 3, Equity, which means fairness. The American Civil Liberties Union states, in a democracy based on the rule of law, principles of justice govern the response to disasters, as well as ordinary circumstances. Everyone in the United States should have an equal opportunity for protection against disaster. Historically, epidemics and natural disasters have caused substantially more illness and death among people who were already disadvantaged because of social, economic, or medical conditions. Justice requires that people who are unable to protect themselves be provided with the means necessary to do so. They go on to emphasize that public health measures must not be based on race, color, ethnicity, national origin, religion, gender, or sexual orientation. The article goes on. Already, anti-immigrant advocates mix fears of terrorism and disease as reasons for cracking down on immigrants. Should a new disease outbreak arise, a public health policy that emphasizes coercion and the dangerousness of the sick will most assuredly fall disproportionately on those who already face discrimination and or are least able to protect themselves. So this brings up a few questions about having to shelter in place, which seems to be our community's biggest response to this present pandemic. First, is each community, neighborhood, city, state, region receiving knowledge and materials equally with other communities? And since all of us, as members of the largest community, which is the U.S., are facing this pandemic together, is there a national state of preparedness which is equitable to all of us who are living and working to help support America? Is our government's actions in this pandemic, in the words of Henry David Thoreau, one that is commanding our respect?